There's always been a certain romance about the sea-based aircraft we know as flying boats. Often very large for their time, their association with the sea seems to give them a completely different quality from land-based types. In pre-war years, when prepared runways were rare, many considered flying boats the best way to accommodate the landing problems of large aircraft. Of all the flying boats ever made, perhaps the most famous was not the largest or the fastest, but it may have been the most effective, and without question, it was the most liked. It was the consolidated PBY, the Catalina. The PBY gained much of its reputation serving in practically every theater of the Second World War. And yet, by many standards, the model was already an old plane when the war began. Its large, high-mounted wings, supported by two stays on each side, gave a strong clue to its ancestry in the biplane flying boats it had been the first to replace. Even this classic government film of the war period, Black Cats, suggests the PBY's limitations.
Anything familiar? That torso with a middle-aged sag? Her speed less than some cars can do. Maneuverable? Some days all right. On others, she brings around like a 10-ton truck. She dives under protest. Wings can't handle half the pressure dive bombers take. Got her? Right. The old Cat. Navy Catalina patrol boat. PBY in a black nightgown for night camouflage. A black cat. Here comes the Cat, and it's a zoom, a signal that she did it again. One more enemy ship on the bottom.
Despite the apparent shortcomings of the PBY, in a war that was ultimately to produce the jet airplane, the ballistic missile, and the atomic bomb, this sturdy flying boat offered reliability, range, lifting power, and above all, endurance. Its range was such that it could fly all-day, non-stop missions. On these missions, it could absorb heavy punishment and still bring crew and often extra passengers home, its objective achieved. This was the basis of what became the legend of the Catalina. Flying boat designers had sought similar qualities to those of the Catalina since the First World War 20 years earlier. It was in that conflict, the first to see full exploitation of military aviation, that the flying boat identified its natural prey. Its number one target was the submarine, a silent and extremely effective weapon. Dollar for dollar, the damage caused by German U-boats made them a highly economical way of waging war. It was quickly realized that if the flying boat could be given sufficient range and lifting power, it could become the most effective anti-U-boat bombing platform. It can hardly be said that any Allied aircraft made a great impact on German U-boats, but the very existence of aerial weapons, even if just for reconnaissance, was a serious threat to submariners. And towards the end of the war, there were recorded instances of direct hits by Allied flying boats on Axis submarines. A trend was being set. By the late 20s and early 30s, the biplane flying boat was established as a very practical way of formatting a large airplane. Unlike most other military types, which were purchased to be on hand in peacetime rather than actually used, many Coast Guard flying boats actually gave regular service, not only in weather observation, but often in mercy missions to sick or injured seamen. These humanitarian missions clearly showed the value of flying boats. were in the peacetime of the 30s to demonstrate a service that only this type of craft could perform, a service that would be required all too often in the war-torn years ahead. The Coast Guard flying boat station in San Diego was to see many Mercy dashes between the wars. But this area of southwest California, with its warm, stable air and nearby flat desert land, was also to attract the attention of early flying pioneers as a suitable base for aviation development. Among these pioneers was Reuben Fleet, an accomplished and enthusiastic aviator. Fleet had many ideas about the directions aviation should take. One of these was to establish the world's first airmail service. The sky over San Diego was to see many firsts in aviation achievement, including the first air-to-air refueling, a difficult task when you consider the primitive flight controls of the time. Southern California's ideal conditions would also attract the pilots of the first non-stop transcontinental flight, a brave step in those early days of aviation. They chose San Diego as their destination in an event that not only broke ground for early transport, but created two new American heroes, MacCready and Kelly. This achievement helped to establish the San Diego area as a major center for innovation in the American aircraft industry. San Diego's other aviation firsts included the Loop-the-Loop, the first aerial bombing, and the first official parachute jump. Given the attributes of the San Diego area and a great deal of encouragement by its city fathers, it's not surprising that Reuben Fleet, who in the early 30s had control of Consolidated Aircraft, chose to move the company's factory from the cold of Buffalo to the warmth of California. One of the early tasks for the young factory was to prepare plans for the Navy's new flying boat. It was another first for San Diego. In the world of biplane flying boats, it was a monoplane. It was called the PBY. During the Depression, contracts were scarce and competition was tough. The move was a big risk for Consolidated. It was a time when plane making was still the domain of the craftsman. Critical eyes and skilled hands, marks of a man who had learned his trade, were very much a part of aircraft manufacturing. This is the main wing assembly area, where two technologies, sophisticated steel framework and old-world hand-stitching, brought canvas and metal together to form the massive PBY wing. This wing was the key to the success of the PBY design. Not only would it provide great lift, but it carried the entire fuel load, giving the PBY its legendary range capability. In the center of the wing, you can see the two portholes that provided access to the main fuel tanks. A partly finished main spar is transported to the next stage of construction. In the fabric department, a special quality unbleached cotton is secured to the wing with knotted stitches that cannot come untied. The use of fabric and metal provided a combination of lightness and strength. The process that achieved that combination consumed hundreds of hours of exacting craftsmanship. The final process in covering the wing was the coating of special aviation dope, a resilient lacquer that stretched the canvas taut and bonded the components together. Extra reinforcing was glued over each rib. The PBY's all-metal hull needed tens of thousands of rivets. Consolidated's rivet machine would produce over 1 million punched out of mild steel every week. Given the extra stresses placed on flying boats with the battering of their large hulls on every landing, seams had to be stronger than usual. So the millions of rivets coming out of the machines were given special treatment. To keep the material at its most workable and provide the tightest fit, each batch was placed in refrigerators and frozen until it was ready for use. Metal ribs and stringers form the shape of a hull that must carry the full weight of each PBY as it lands. The cold rivets must fasten sheet metal to this framework into a skin that remains watertight against the hard buffeting of each return to the water's surface. Wooden wedges ensure the closest fit between framework and skin. And only when the seal is perfect is the entire hull rotated to its upright position and moved on to the next process. The whole complex jigsaw of thousands of preformed pieces is assembled in a process that demands the finest tolerances before the fuselage takes its final form. The shape that will make the PBY instantly recognizable is beginning to emerge. These craftsmen are, in a sense, as much boat builders as plane makers. Just like a boat, the PBY must float, and no water can be allowed to find its way through the skin. This is the unique center spar, which supports the wing. In an unusual piece of design, it also houses the flight engineer, who sits high above the two pilots, close to the two engines he constantly monitors. At this stage, the clean, shark-like profile of the hull is almost complete. The final test of waterproofing will follow. It would take enormous tanks to immerse the hull. Instead, its integrity is proven simply by filling the inside with water and checking for leaks. Then, it's off to the paint shop to be scraped down clean in preparation for the many coats of a waterproof paint that provides final protection. The paint, which has to survive the wear of marine landings and takeoffs and the corrosive effect of salt water, is applied in carefully controlled conditions. Positive air pressure is maintained by large fans, making sure no dust or other particles find their way in. After painting, the completed fuselages are stored, ready for fitting the main wing spar. These are the early model PBY-3s with their distinctive flat-side canopies. They're part of a pre-war order for 65 aircraft placed by the United States Navy. At this stage, the main wing spar is brought in to be fitted to the small surface of the center column. You can see the thickness of the wing, the center section of which is almost completely occupied by fuel tanks, holding 1,750 gallons. The PBY was powered by two 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. They were secured to the wing with just 4 bolts each. The dry California climate made it possible to install the massive wings out in the open. This simple fact saved thousands of feet of hangar space. A feature of the PBY was its retractable wingtip floats. In flight, these could be raised so they became an extension of the wing, reducing unnecessary drag and improving the plane's handling. The floats were lowered again for landing. Before each plane was handed over to the Navy, it was thoroughly inspected. In most aircraft at the time, the pilot and engineer were stationed close together, but in the PBY they were separated and could only talk to each other by interphone. You can see the engineer's window located in the wing spar at the bottom of the picture. The maiden flight of a new PBY. The letters PB stood for patrol boat, and the Y was the manufacturer's identification. The PBY's greatest asset was its range, and the ability to fly on just one engine was a key factor in conserving fuel to increase range further still. The PBY's other great quality was its ruggedness, stamina that was built in during manufacture. Like most aircraft that stay in production over a long period, the PBY was to evolve. It started as a well-designed, purpose-built flying boat bomber. Most of the first batch of almost 200 went to the United States Navy. When the first production models appeared in 1936, it could have been supposed that only a few hundred would ever be produced. But world events took a sudden turn, and in 1939, as soon as the war in Europe began, the British ordered large numbers of the Mark V. The United States Navy ordered an extra 200 to patrol what were then its neutral waters. Not only did delivery of the first Royal Air Force PBYs signal the start of a long and fruitful relationship with the model, the RAF also gave the PBY its name, the Catalina. It stuck to be adopted almost universally. Another model that interested the British was the 5A. Although similar to the flying boat version, the 5A was an amphibian, able to operate from both sea and land. Although this model was heavier, slower, and had less range than the standard flying boat, it was versatile, and nearly half the aircraft delivered were amphibians. The Royal Air Force acquisition was timely. With Britain at war, it was desperate for all types of aircraft. But the Catalina was to be a key factor in maintaining the supply lines from North America to besieged Britain. Operating from bases in the North Atlantic, PBYs provided escort to the vulnerable supply convoys, which would otherwise have been sitting ducks for the predatory German U-boats. The Catalina's 4,000-mile range provided effective, but not total coverage to vital merchant shipping. Many times the Atlantic corridor was almost closed by the threat of the U-boats, and the Catalina was the first Allied weapon to turn the tide. In the North Atlantic, RAF Catalinas carried the British-designed ASV aircraft-to-surface vessel anti-submarine radar. It was used effectively as a supplement to visual observation. Once a sighting was made, the PBYs used bombs and depth charges to launch the attack. December 7th, 1941, off Pearl Harbor in the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese task force is about to deal the U.S. 7th Fleet a cruel blow. A blow that will bring America into the war and lead to the conflict's ultimate conclusion. At Pearl Harbor, PBYs took their share of the battering. The Aleutian Islands are situated in the North Pacific Ocean, forming a chain stretching 1,200 miles west-southwest of Alaska toward Siberia, forming the southern boundary of the Bering Sea. There are 4 groups of islands, part of the territory of Alaska. This region has a peculiar weather pattern. Cold air from the pole meets the warm, moist air masses of the Japanese current to form cyclonic disturbances. Because of the Earth's rotation, these disturbances move constantly from west to east. The Japanese were aware of this pattern and realized its ability to allow them to operate behind the moving curtain of a storm. In the early days of June 1942, they employed this advantage in an all-out attempt to secure absolute domination of the Pacific Ocean. Behind a storm, they dispatched 2 invasion forces to 2 widely separated objectives, Midway Island and Dutch Harbor. The operation was designed to break the American line of sea defense upon which the security of the Pacific coast depends. There is little doubt that the decisive United States win over the Japanese carrier force at Midway broke the back of Japanese naval air power. Although American intelligence was aware the Japanese fleet was in the vicinity, the pilot of a humble PBY made the sighting that confirmed Japanese presence and precipitated the battle. On the northern front, at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians, the American forces were also prepared with an effective counterattack. Conditions in the Aleutians were almost impossible to bear. In some ways, the weather was the worst enemy of both sides and took a terrible toll. But PBY patrols persevered, looking for enemy vessels. In spite of the extreme conditions, the PBYs stayed in the air, searching for their archenemy, the Japanese U-boats. It's a notable fact that Japanese U-boats in the Pacific had nothing like the early success of the German U-boats in the Atlantic, nor did they match the success of American subs that hunted the Pacific. One reason for this is the presence on the Allied side of the PBY. The Japanese simply had no anti-submarine weapon that was the PBY's equivalent. The American presence effectively held the line, and Dutch Harbor was as close as the Japanese ever came to mainland America. The Catalina had again played its part. But the PBY was not without its competitors. The more advanced Martin Mariner twin-engine long-range reconnaissance bomber was also a very effective flying boat. It continued in production in various forms long after the war. This particular model re-equipped many of the older Catalina squadrons as the famous consolidated flying boats started to age. Back at the consolidated San Diego plant, PBY construction forged ahead and was to go on almost throughout the war. Even though later models were becoming available, the proven characteristics of a plane first ordered in 1933 was still hard to beat. By now, it wasn't only Consolidated who built the Catalina. They were also manufactured by Boeing, Vickers, and the Naval Air Factory. Over 3,000 of the type went to the United States Navy alone. Additional substantial orders came from the British, other Commonwealth nations, and the Dutch. Although there had been many versions, it was still basically the Model 5 that occupied the production line in quantity, either in its full flying boat form or in the more versatile amphibian model. The Model 5 and onwards can easily be distinguished by the large blister canopies mounted on each side of the rear fuselage. The blister provided a gun position and excellent visibility for an observer. Although the Catalina dominated much of Consolidated's war effort, it was not its only flying boat at the time. In 1936, the company had invested heavily, tooling up for the much larger four-engine heavy patrol bomber, the PB-2Y, the Consolidated Coronado. The PBY had set new standards for its time, but there was a strengthening school of thought that a really large design using four engines would be the ultimate flying boat. The British had successfully employed the four-engine Sunderland, and there were some clever Axis designs also utilizing large hulls. This new flying boat from San Diego was an attempt to employ the same philosophy. The Consolidated PB-2Y Coronado was a giant of a plane, with four large engines and a double-decker fuselage. but it still used retractable floats, similar to those of the PBY. It was only ever produced in a pure flying boat version and was the company's design model 29. The Coronado entered service in 1941, but was never manufactured in large numbers. Many of the patrol bomber versions were converted into naval ambulances, with accommodation for up to 25 stretcher cases. There were various other passenger and cargo transports, which vindicated the concept of Consolidated's giant flying boat. However it is judged as a weapon, it was a spectacular sight on the water and in the air. But the concept of really large flying boats, like those produced by Consolidated, Sikorsky, and others, was coming to an end. In the course of the war, thousands of airstrips had been built around the world, spectacular landings and takeoffs on the water, about to become a rarity. Consolidated's attempt at a really large flying boat was not to result in a long production run. But its four-engine bomber, the B-24 Liberator, was turned out in numbers exceeding 12,000. The family resemblance between the land plane and its close flying boat relative is striking. But far away on remote Pacific islands, the basic PBY Catalina was left to get on with the dirty business of war. Carrying assortments of bombs, depth charges, and torpedoes, and usually defended by no more than a few 50 caliber machine guns, the Navy's PBYs worked from primitive bases where improvisation was a way of life. Preparing a PBY for a naval assault was a laborious but necessary chore. As the aircraft flew into harm's way, most knew that its limited defensive armament would be of little value. But in the night assault role, the Cat's best defense was its flat black finish. In this situation, the legend of the Black Cats was born. Throughout much of the American involvement in the Second World War, the Navy operated from secret bases scattered across the Pacific Islands. Small numbers of PBYs worked alone, performing aerial reconnaissance, mine-laying, air-sea rescue, dive bombing, and torpedo attack missions. The success of these missions hinged on the basic operational qualities of the PBY and on the teams of men who learned to fly and maintain them in unfamiliar conditions. This learning process was one of experience and improvisation rather than any textbook operation. The Catalina's high-mounted engines were close together and made it somewhat difficult to steer while taxiing. On the takeoff run, the throttles were opened gradually to minimize visibility loss and damage to the propellers through spray. In some conditions and under heavy load, The PBY needed up to 3 miles of run-up before unsticking and finally taking to the air. Usually flying into dusk and frequently into turbulent tropical weather, the crews on an average Black Cat mission learn to accept a very rough ride as a normal operating condition. Their confidence in the Catalina's ability to survive these tropical elements didn't make the trip any more comfortable. Without the usual electronic navigation aids, plotting the PBY's course was less a science than an art form. One of the paradoxes crews learned to live with was that while a dark moonless night provided safety from Japanese night fighters, it reduced the navigator's ability to confirm his position with star sightings, his only real navigational resource. On those dark nights, a break in the clouds was welcome. It allowed a quick star sighting from the exposed nose turret, confirming whether or not the PBY was on course, and gave a brief check for Japanese night fighters. On this particular mission, Black Cat crews are searching for a Japanese convoy thought to be at anchor in an enemy harbor. In the dark conditions, the crew strain to see any clue to the location of their target. As they approach, the PBY reduces altitude in the hope of making a positive sighting. Surprise and the darkness of night are the Black Cat's only defenses. Soon, its engines will be heard and bring the usual response from Japanese anti-aircraft guns. In spite of the intensity of the Japanese fire, there is no sign of the convoy. The search must continue out at sea. And all the time there is the threat of the Japanese night fighters, now well aware of the PBY's presence. Most Black Cats had their bomb sights removed and substituted with radar altimeters. This not only allowed accurate low-level bombing, but gave the ability to fly safely at low altitudes in the dark. Low-level flying ability was very useful in avoiding the eyes of Japanese night fighter pilots. The Cats, with their matte black paintwork skimming just above water level, were almost impossible to see. Over the ocean, at night, even a large convoy of ships is an elusive target. On moonlit nights, once a sighting was made, the trick was to try and get the target between the Cat and the moon. Sometimes that wasn't possible. When a sighting was made, in this case a convoy of ammunition freighters, signals were often dispatched to other Cats that may be in the area. On these night convoy searches, the Cats carried a variety of armament and ordnance. Combinations included 2 500 and 2 1,000-pound bombs, or 2 500-pound bombs and a torpedo. As the Cats started their bombing rounds, it was a classic case of David and Goliath. In spite of all rumors to the contrary, the Cats were capable of diving, but the strain on those big high-mounted wings was immense. In a dive from 3,000 feet down to masthead level, pilots reported that the wings were really flapping. As well as their bomb loads, the Cats used their machine guns to retaliate against the anti-aircraft fire from the ships. In this apparently unequal struggle, the Cats achieved an extraordinary success rate. U.S. Navy PBY Squadron VP-52, between November 1943 and June 1944, destroyed or damaged 16 enemy ships, including submarines, tankers, cruisers, and destroyers. Many other squadrons operating throughout the Pacific had comparable records. And more often than not, after prowling around in the night and taking an impossible amount of punishment, these cats came back. But it wasn't just the air crew who made the night missions in the Pacific a success. Those who served as ground engineers, the maintenance men, had the daunting task of repairing the damage sustained in the night missions and keeping what were fast becoming old planes in the air. Maintaining the Pratt & Whitney double Wasps on a remote island somewhere in the Pacific required ingenuity. Recycling old parts and making others when replacements were not available, ground engineers found the PBY to be a plane that demanded little and forgave much. Often repairs needed little more than a pair of tin snips to patch bullet holes, a reminder to the air crew of just how precarious the night missions were. But not all PBY machines were instruments of aggression. Their versatility was demonstrated in many different ways. Throughout the war, they were used for air-sea rescue, searching the oceans for survivors of countless air battles in theaters across the globe. This air-sea rescue role, sometimes referred to as the Dumbo missions, saved hundreds of lives by rescuing airmen and sailors alike. Often, to make the rescues possible, the pilots would have to execute full stall landings on swells of 8 feet or more. This could be a dangerous maneuver, and sometimes the cat crew, in attempting a rescue, would find itself in the water, waiting for the comforting drone of the next cat to come along. Once loaded with survivors, the next problem was taking off. Sometimes it was necessary for the pilots to drain fuel and jettison whatever could be thrown overboard. With a load of over 20 people and a large swell running, these takeoffs needed luck and good timing. If on the takeoff run a swell threw the cat in the air, the moment had to be seized by grabbing full power and hoping for the best. Few planes apart from the PBY could have come through such difficult operations. In the course of World War II, it was not only military Catalinas that saw service. The Qantas Perth to Colombo flights are legends in the history of civil aviation. While the war in the Pacific went on, the Australian airline Qantas used 5 Catalinas to provide a small but continuing service, flying a maximum of 3 passengers from Australia to Colombo in a flight that would take no less than 24 hours. The wear and tear on engines was phenomenal, and these Qantas Indian Ocean flights are to this day the longest duration scheduled trips that any airline has offered. The Catalina's war record, whether in combat or civilian service, was magnificent. From the polar regions to the tropics, and in both hemispheres, it flew with a distinction achieved by few other airplanes. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't agile. It just worked. Post-war, serviceable PBYs became sought-after items. The old qualities of reliability, ease of service, and long range had much the same appeal to commercial operators as they did to the military. Hundreds of ex-service machines were snapped up by civil airlines and small private operators. Just how many Catalinas flew in civilian roles over the land and sea for which they'd fought is a tantalizing mystery. One thing is for certain. For a plane that was originally ordered in 1933 and considered by some to be obsolete by the war's end, the Catalina has survived magnificently and is still flying. It deserves its reputation as one of the world's great planes.